In a dusty cellar, they found the horrifying truth. The woman on death row wasn't just innocent. She was the last living heir to the family the judge's ancestors had murdered. In the town of Havenwood, a place ruled by fear, justice was long since buried. A young mother, Eleanor Vance, is condemned to die for a crime she didn't commit. Her only sin was loving a man who dared to seek the truth. As the gallows is built and the town watches in silence, a giant stranger rides into town. He carries not a gun, but his dead brother's final sealed secret, a truth with the power to save one life and destroy a century-old empire of lies. The silence in the Havenwood courthouse was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with the scent of old timber and fear. It clung to the pews, muted the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of afternoon light, and settled like a shroud over the heads of the townsfolk. Eleanor Vance, known to everyone as Ellie, stood before the bench, her body trembling not from the autumn chill, but from the cold dread coiling in her gut. In her arms, her infant son, Leo, slept on, blissfully unaware that his mother's world and his own future was about to be extinguished. At the bench, Judge Silas Blackwood sat enthroned, a man carved from the same hard granite as the surrounding Oregon mountains. His face was a mask of stern piety, but his eyes, small and dark, held a glint of something far older and colder than justice. He surveyed the silent courtroom, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the loggers, the merchants, and the mothers who had known Ellie since she was a girl shelving books at the town library. They were her neighbors, her friends, yet today their eyes would not meet hers. They stared at the floorboards, at their own hands, anywhere but at the woman condemned. Eleanor Vance. The judge's voice was not loud, but it filled every corner of the room, as final as a nail being driven into a coffin lid. This court has considered the testimony. It has weighed the evidence of your transgression. He let the word hang in the air, a stain on her character. In bearing a child out of wedlock, you have not only defied the laws of God, but have gravely endangered the moral order of this community. You have become a symbol of decay, a threat to the very foundation of Havenwood. Ellie clutched Leo tighter, the soft warmth of his small body, the only real thing in a world turned nightmare. A lie. It was all a monstrous lie. But her truth was buried 6 feet deep with her husband Liam. The judge's words were the dirt being shoveled over them both. Therefore, Blackwood continued, savoring the weight of his power, it is the judgment of this court that you have forfeited your place in this decent society. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was thin and screaming. The sentence is death. A collective stifled gasp rippled through the pews, a sound of horror choked back by fear. Ellie felt the floor drop away from her. The word echoed, impossibly, death. For what? For loving a man? For bringing his child into the world? Across the room, she saw young Deputy Miller flinch, his jaw tight with a conflict he dared not voice. Old Dr. Thorne, seated in the back, closed his eyes, his face a portrait of weary sorrow. But no one spoke, no one moved. Judge Blackwood slammed the gavel down. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room, the final, irrevocable punctuation on her life. This court is adjourned, he declared. 2 guards stepped forward, their faces grim and impassive. As they took her arms, Ellie looked out one last time, not at the judge, but at the people of Havenwood. In their averted eyes, she saw the town's true sickness, a cowardice so profound it would rather watch an innocent woman hang than risk the wrath of one powerful man. Her heart didn't break with despair, but hardened with a terrible silent vow. They could take her life, but they would never erase the truth. News of the verdict spread through Havenwood not like a wildfire, but like a frost, silently blanketing the town and chilling the marrow in its bones. Shutters were drawn. Doors were bolted. The main street, usually bustling with loggers and merchants, grew quiet and empty, surrendered to the long, creeping shadows of the afternoon. It was into this deadened silence that a lone rider appeared, a figure so large he seemed to blot out the fading sun. He rode a dust-colored Mustang that looked as weary as the man on its back, and the rhythmic clop of its hooves was the only sound in a town holding its breath. This was Caleb Vance. He was built on a scale that seemed ill-suited for the civilized world, with shoulders as broad as an axe handle and hands that could likely palm a tree trunk. Years spent as a forest ranger in the remote wilderness had weathered his face, carving deep lines around eyes that had seen more storms than society. He had left Havenwood a decade ago after a bitter fight with his younger brother Liam, and had never looked back. Not until a 2-week-old letter, forwarded from one remote outpost to another, had finally found him, bearing news of his brother's accident. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, the leather of his saddle groaning in protest. From behind curtained windows, eyes watched him, noting the grim set of his jaw and the quiet intensity of his gaze. He wasn't just a stranger, he was a Vance. His presence was an echo of the man they had just condemned, a ghost walking in the daylight. In his worn duster pocket, Caleb's fingers brushed against the 2 items that had driven him down from the mountains. The letter Liam had written but never sent, its seal still unbroken, and a heavy, ornate iron key that felt impossibly cold to the touch. He looked across the square, his eyes landing on the half-finished structure being erected near the courthouse. The raw, pale wood stood out against the darkening pines. A gallows, a fresh wave of guilt, sharp and suffocating, washed over him. He had let pride keep him away, let a foolish argument sever the only real family he had. Now his brother was dead, and the woman Liam loved was about to follow him, all while their child was left an orphan. The letter in his pocket felt like a judgment, the key a burden. They were the only things left of his brother, the last pieces of a puzzle he now had to solve. He didn't know the full truth yet, but standing in the heart of that silent, fearful town, Caleb made a vow. He wasn't just here for answers, he was here for atonement. Darkness had fallen outside the bars of Ellie's cell, a thick, final darkness that mirrored the despair in her heart. She refused to weep. Tears were a luxury, a surrender she would not grant Judge Blackwood. Instead, she closed her eyes and let her memory drift back 1 year, back to a time when the world was filled with light and the scent of sawdust and fresh-baked bread. She retreated to the last truly happy day she had known, a memory she polished like a precious stone to keep its edges from dulling. It was a Sunday. Liam was spread out on the floor of their small cottage, surrounded by a sea of brittle yellowed documents and old county maps. He was a journalist with a hunger for the stories buried beneath the surface of things, and Havenwood, he claimed, was a town built on a graveyard of secrets. Little Leo was asleep in his cradle, and Ellie sat in her armchair, watching the firelight dance across her husband's determined face. He looked up and caught her gaze, his expression softening. "This is it, Elle," he'd said, his voice a low, excited hum. He tapped a faded property deed from the 1880s. The Blackwood family fortune, the timber rights, this whole town. It all started right here. But the story doesn't add up. It's like a chapter was torn out of our history, and Silas Blackwood has spent his whole life making sure no one ever finds it. "Be careful, Liam," she had whispered, the same warning she always gave. "The judge doesn't like people digging." He had come to her then, kneeling by her chair and taking her hand. His own were stained with ink and smelled of old paper. "That's why we have to," he said, his eyes burning with a fierce integrity that had made her fall in love with him. "Imagine Leo growing up in a place where the truth matters, where we aren't all living under the thumb of one man's lies." He squeezed her hand, a silent vow passing between them. "Just a little longer, I promise. Once I have the proof, we can build a real future here." That was the promise she clung to, the promise of a life beyond the shadows of the courthouse. The promise he had been working to fulfill the morning he'd kissed her goodbye and headed to the archives. The promise that died with him. The memory dissolved, replaced by the one that followed. The frantic pounding on her door late that night. A pale, stammering Deputy Miller stood on her porch, hat in his hands, reciting the official story of a tragic logging accident, of failed brakes on a steep grade. The words had meant nothing. She knew, with the chilling certainty of a wife who knew her husband's enemies, that it was no accident, it was an execution. And now, sitting in the cold, she understood that hers was meant to be the final act in the judge's perfectly crafted lie. The next morning, a pale sun did little to warm the chill that had settled over Havenwood. The gallows in the town square was finished, its raw pine frame stark and hungry against the deep green of the forest. Caleb Vance stood across the street, nursing a cup of bitter coffee from the town's only diner, watching. He'd spent the early hours asking questions and had been met with a uniform, suffocating wall of silence. The blacksmith suddenly had urgent work to do. The woman at the general store couldn't recall seeing Liam for weeks before his death. They answered in clipped sentences, their eyes darting toward the courthouse, toward the long shadow it cast over everything. He knew this brand of fear. It was the kind that grew in isolated places, cultivated by a single powerful hand until it became as natural as the moss on the trees. Finished with his coffee, he walked to the sheriff's office. Deputy Miller was behind the desk, looking as though he hadn't slept. The young man stiffened the moment Caleb's large frame filled the doorway. "I need to see the report on my brother's accident," Caleb said, his voice calm and even, leaving no room for refusal. Miller swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. It's a closed case, Mr. Vance. The county coroner ruled it accidental." He began shuffling papers, a nervous tick. Terrible tragedy. Caleb didn't move. He simply waited, his silence more demanding than any shout. "My brother kept a journal, a leather-bound book he took everywhere. It wasn't listed among his effects." "I wouldn't know anything about that," Miller said, his voice a little too quick. "Everything from the scene was processed according to procedure." Caleb took a step closer, his shadow falling over the desk. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "Liam wasn't careless, Deputy. He was meticulous. He wouldn't have been on that logging road unless he was meeting someone. And that truck didn't just have a brake failure. He was hunted. You and I both know it." Miller's composure finally cracked. A flicker of something, shame, fear, regret, crossed his face before he stamped it out. He stood up abruptly, knocking a stack of files to the floor. "I've got nothing more to say to you," he snapped, his voice brittle. "You should get on your horse and ride out of here before you find trouble you can't handle." He bent down to gather the scattered papers, his movements jerky. As he straightened up, he brushed past Caleb, heading for the door. In that fleeting moment, Caleb felt a small, hard object being pressed into the pocket of his duster. It was Liam's journal. Miller didn't look back. He paused at the door and spoke to the street outside, his words a desperate, choked whisper. "Be careful," he said. "In Havenwood, the truth is the kind of thing that can get a man killed. It already got one Vance killed. Don't make it two." The door clicked shut, leaving Caleb alone in the office, the weight of his brother's last words now resting in his hand. Caleb found a secluded spot by the creek at the edge of town to read his brother's journal. The pages were filled with Liam's tight, urgent script, notes on property lines, tax records, and one name that appeared more than any other, Dr. Aris Thorne. An arrow was drawn next to the name with a single cryptic question. "He knows. Why is he so afraid?" Caleb closed the book. It was time to find out. Dr. Thorne's practice was run out of his home, a grim Victorian house that seemed to sag under the weight of its own secrets. The air inside was stale, smelling of rubbing alcohol and dust. The doctor himself was a small, frail man, his hands afflicted with a tremor that made the teacup on his desk rattle softly. He looked at Caleb with the haunted eyes of a man who had seen too much and said too little. He had been a friend of the Vance boy's father, a bond that now seemed to be a source of pain rather than comfort. "I can't help you, Caleb," Thorne said, his voice thin as parchment. He wouldn't meet Caleb's gaze, focusing instead on a dusty anatomical chart on the wall. "I'm a doctor. I treat sickness. I don't meddle in other matters." "Liam thought you knew something," Caleb said, his tone gentle but firm. "He wrote about you. He said you were a good man trapped in a bad town." The old doctor flinched, the compliment landing like a blow. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the rattling of the teacup. "Your brother was looking in the wrong places," he finally whispered, his eyes darting toward the window. "His murder wasn't the beginning of Havenwood's sickness. It was just a symptom. The disease took root a long, long time ago." He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "You want the truth? Stop looking at the logging ledgers. Start looking at the headstones." He spoke of the Great Sickness of 1888, a supposed plague that had swept through the original logging settlement, wiping out nearly everyone. "It was the Cartwright family who founded this town," Thorne said, his voice trembling. "They owned this valley, every last tree. Then the sickness came, the whole family, gone in a month. Tragic." But there was no tragedy in his eyes, only a deep, abiding fear. He looked at Caleb, and for the first time his gaze was direct, a silent plea for understanding. "History is written by the victors, Caleb. Don't waste your time counting the dead. You want to solve your brother's murder, find out who was the only one who survived." Caleb sat in a cheap room at the town's boarding house, the door wedged shut with a chair. With Dr. Thorne's cryptic warning echoing in his ears, he opened his brother's journal again. This time, he wasn't just reading Liam's words. He was looking through his brother's eyes, searching for the pattern Liam had been on the verge of uncovering. He found it in a section filled with notes on Havenwood's official founding in 1889, the year after the Great Sickness. Liam had painstakingly cross-referenced the property deeds with the obituaries from that fateful year. The Cartwright family, father, mother, 3 sons, all dead within weeks. Dozens of other settlers, the same, but one name stood out, circled in Liam's angry red ink: Jedediah Blackwood, the great-grandfather of Judge Silas Blackwood. According to the Old Town Charter, Jedediah, a humble trader at the time, had miraculously survived the plague. He then filed a claim on the abandoned Cartwright timberlands, declaring it his solemn duty to keep the settlement from dying out completely. It was a perfect story, a heroic origin for a powerful family, but Liam had found the lie. Scrawled in the journal's margin was a chilling note. Found the old shipping manifests from Portland. Jedediah Blackwood received a large crate of arsenic-based pesticide just 2 weeks before the sickness began. It was never used for farming. The truth hit Caleb with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a plague. It was poison. A systematic, cold-blooded massacre designed to look like an act of God. His brother hadn't been investigating a simple case of land fraud. He had been unearthing a century-old mass murder. Every lie the judge told, every threat he made, was to protect this original sin. The foundation of Havenwood wasn't built on pioneer grit. It was built on the bones of the Cartwright family. Caleb finally understood. Liam's obsession with the town's official birth and death records, his repeated attempts to gain access to the courthouse archives. It was all to find the final, damning proof. The original death certificates, likely forged by a corrupt doctor, would be the key. And those records were kept in the one place in Havenwood more secure than a bank vault, guarded by the one man whose entire empire rested upon that lie. The proof was in Judge Blackwood's courthouse, and Caleb knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the judge would sooner burn the whole town to the ground than let that secret see the light of day. A rat in a maze doesn't know it's being watched until the walls start to move. Judge Blackwood had felt the shift the moment Caleb Vance rode into town. He saw it in Deputy Miller's averted eyes and heard it in the sudden, unnatural quiet of his community. That evening, he summoned the young deputy to his chambers. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply reminded Miller of who had given him his badge, who owned the bank that held his family's mortgage, and who, with a single word, could erase him. The terrified deputy confessed everything. That night, as Caleb walked the dark path back to his boarding house, two shadows detached themselves from the alley between the saloon and the blacksmith shop. They were loggers, big men who smelled of pine sap and cheap whiskey, and they moved with the brutal efficiency of hired muscle. They didn't speak. The fight was a short, ugly affair of splintering wood and dull, heavy thuds. Caleb was strong, but they were desperate. They left him bruised and aching in the dirt, his ribs screaming in protest. A warning, one of them rasped, before they melted back into the darkness. From the judge, get out of Havenwood. But the physical assault was only the opening salvo. The judge's real attack, the one meant to cripple them, was aimed at Ellie. The next morning, a stone-faced guard entered her cell, accompanied by a woman from the town. The guard announced that due to concerns for the child's welfare, Leo was being moved to a more stable environment. When Ellie protested, clutching her son, the guard roughly grabbed her arm. A mother's instinct, fierce and primal, took over. Ellie shoved him back, putting herself between the man and her baby. It was all they needed. Within the hour, Judge Blackwood stood before her cell, his face a mask of feigned disappointment. "I am told you assaulted an officer, Eleanor," he said, his voice dripping with false sorrow. "This violent outburst proves you are an unfit mother." He nodded to the guard. "Take the child." Ellie's pleas turned to shrieks as they pried her sleeping son from her arms. It was a pain beyond comprehension, a tearing of the soul that was infinitely worse than any sentence of death. They were taking the last piece of Liam, the only reason she had held on to hope. As they carried Leo away, his confused cries echoing down the cold stone corridor, Ellie collapsed against the bars, a raw, guttural sob escaping her lips. Blackwood watched her break, a flicker of cruel satisfaction in his eyes. He had found her soul and, with a surgeon's precision, he had cut it out. Judge Blackwood had made a grave miscalculation. He believed that absolute cruelty would inspire absolute fear. Instead, in the quiet, God-fearing homes of Havenwood, it had awakened something else: shame. The news of Ellie's baby being torn from her arms spread through the town like a sickness of the soul. It was one thing to stand by while a woman was condemned on trumped-up charges. It was another to watch a mother be separated from her infant. The act was so fundamentally wrong, so profoundly cruel, that it cracked the very foundation of fear the judge had built his empire on. Caleb felt the shift as he limped through town the next day, his bruised ribs a dull throb with every step. A logger who had turned his back on him yesterday now gave him a slow, deliberate nod. The woman at the general store, who had claimed ignorance, left a small parcel of bread and dried meat on the railing of his boarding house. They were small gestures, silent apologies, but they were the first sparks in a town that had been dark for a generation. The fire was lit by the most unlikely of hands. That evening, as Caleb sat in the shadows of the church, planning his next move, a figure emerged from the dusk. It was Martha Thorne, the doctor's wife, a quiet woman known for her prize-winning roses and little else. She moved with a purpose he had not seen in anyone else, her face set with a resolve that was decades in the making. She said nothing, but pressed a heavy, rust-pitted iron key into his hand. Her own hand was trembling, but her eyes were steady. "My Aris is a good man, but fear has been his sickness for 40 years, she whispered, her voice fierce. "What the judge did to that child. He crossed a line that even God will not forgive. And I will not stand by while my husband's silence makes him an accomplice." She closed Caleb's fingers over the key. "This opens the cellar beneath his office. It's where the old town records were kept, before the courthouse was built. He's never had the courage to look, or the strength to destroy them." She looked at Caleb, her eyes pleading. "Find the truth, Mr. Vance. What my husband has been too afraid to do, you must do now. For Ellie, for that baby, and for the soul of this town he's so afraid of losing." Before he could thank her, she turned and disappeared back into the twilight, leaving him with the cold, heavy weight of the past in his palm. Caleb knew he couldn't enter that cellar alone. He needed a witness, someone who wore a badge. He found Deputy Miller sitting in his patrol car behind the courthouse, staring at the gallows. Caleb didn't make a speech. He simply stood at the window and held up the iron key. "Tonight, you decide," Caleb said, his voice low. "You can spend the rest of your life as his man, or you can be your own for one night and help me save an innocent woman." For a long moment, Miller wrestled with his fear. Then, with a grim, determined nod, he shut off the engine and got out of the car. The cellar door groaned open, releasing a blast of cold, stale air that smelled of damp earth and decaying paper. By the dim glow of Miller's lantern, they saw a tomb of forgotten history. Wooden crates, their contents long since turned to dust, were stacked to the ceiling alongside crumbling medical texts and water-stained ledgers. It was Miller who found it, tucked away in a corner, a heavy, locked metal strongbox, exactly the kind a man would use to bury a secret. The key slid into the lock and turned with a grating shriek. Inside lay the town's original sin. The first document was a private medical ledger from 1888, kept by the town's first doctor. The handwriting was a spidery, guilty scrawl, detailing the symptoms of the plague victims: violent stomach pains, convulsions, paralysis. Miller, who had seen his share of hunting accidents, recognized the signs. "This isn't plague," he whispered, his face pale in the lantern light. "This is poison." The ledger was a confession, a terrified man's attempt to record the truth he was being forced to hide. But it was the documents beneath the ledger that stopped Caleb's heart. It was a Cartwright family Bible. Tucked inside was a birth certificate for a daughter, Elizabeth Cartwright, born just a year before the massacre. A frantic note from her mother detailed how the sickly infant had been sent away to live with healthier relatives in California, a desperate attempt to save her life. With it was Liam's own research, a painstaking trail of birth and marriage records, tracking that bloodline through 4 generations, through name changes and cross-country moves. The trail ended in Havenwood, the last name on Liam's family tree. The sole living heir of the murdered Cartwright family was Eleanor Vance. The weight of the discovery was crushing. Ellie's condemnation wasn't just about silencing Liam's investigation. It was the final, vicious act in a conspiracy that had begun over a century ago. The judge wasn't just trying to cover up a crime. He was trying to exterminate the last of a bloodline he had usurped. And Leo, the infant son who now lay in a stranger's cradle, was not just an orphan. He was the rightful heir to all of Havenwood. Miller looked at Caleb, his eyes wide with horror. "My God, Caleb," he breathed. "He's not just trying to kill her. He's trying to erase history itself." Judge Blackwood was a man who trusted no one and believed in the vigilance of paranoia. Later that night, guided by a sixth sense that his world was tilting off its axis, he went to Dr. Thorne's house. He didn't knock. He found the cellar door unlocked and saw the desecrated strongbox, its lid gaping open like a violated tomb. The ledger and the Bible were gone. A cold, reptilian fury coiled in his chest. The secret his family had killed to protect, the lie that had granted them a century of power, was out. His response was swift and absolute. Just after midnight, the town's fire bell began to toll, its frantic, clanging peal ripping through the night and dragging people from their beds. It was not a summons for a fire, but a declaration of war. Men loyal to the judge, hard-faced loggers and deputies from outlying counties who owed him everything, emerged from the shadows, rifles in hand. They moved with chilling efficiency, blocking the only road out of Havenwood with a barricade of heavy timber trucks. The single telephone line connecting the town to the outside world was cut. Havenwood was sealed. Caleb and Miller emerged from the back of the clinic into a transformed world. The air once still, now crackled with tension. Armed men stood on rooftops, their silhouettes stark against the moonlit sky. A town crier, one of Blackwood's clerks, walked the main street, his voice amplified by the unnatural silence. "By order of Judge Blackwood," he announced, "due to threats against the peace of this community, the execution of the prisoner Eleanor Vance has been moved. It will be carried out at sunrise." Sunrise. They had less than 5 hours. The documents in Caleb's hands, the proof that could exonerate Ellie and dismantle an empire of lies, were now just worthless paper. They were trapped inside the fortress of the man they sought to expose. Miller looked at the barricade, his face ashen. "He's turned the whole town into a cage," he whispered, the reality of their situation crashing down on him. "There's no way out. He's going to kill her, and then he's going to kill us." Caleb looked past the armed guards toward the cold, dark shape of the gallows. The judge had taken away any hope of outside help, leaving them with only one impossible option. They couldn't get the truth out of Havenwood, so they would have to make it explode from within. The race against the dawn had begun. Desperation, Caleb knew, could either paralyze a man or grant him perfect clarity. As the first hints of gray lightened the eastern sky, he saw his path. He was a forest ranger, not a soldier. He didn't fight armies, he fought wildfires. He understood that you didn't attack the heart of the blaze. You starved it of fuel, you created fire breaks, and you changed the direction of the wind. He gathered Miller and a handful of trusted men, the blacksmith, a few grim-faced loggers, in the darkness behind the church. He laid out the plan, not with military commands, but with the quiet logic of a man who understood the terrain. "We can't fight them head-on," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but we can pull them apart. We create chaos. We make them look east when the real threat is coming from the west." The rebellion began not with a gunshot, but with the roar of a logging skidder. On the far side of town, 2 of the loggers fired up the heavy machine and sent it rumbling down a side street, its steel blade tearing up the dirt road and drawing a half-dozen of Blackwood's men to investigate. Moments later, on the opposite end of town, the blacksmith and his sons overturned a heavy wagon, creating another blockade and another distraction. It was the desperate, brilliant strategy of a guerrilla war fought by ordinary men. While the judge's forces were stretched thin, scrambling to contain the spreading chaos, Deputy Miller slipped through the back alleys, his heart pounding. His target was Dr. Thorne's house. He found the old doctor sitting in his study, a broken man waiting for the end. It was Martha Thorne who met Miller at the door, her face pale but resolute. She walked to her husband and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Aris," she said, her voice filled with a lifetime of love and frustration. "You have been silent for 40 years, while a poison seeped into the soul of this town. Today, you can be the cure. Go with him. Speak the truth that your conscience has been screaming all these years." Something in the old man's eyes shifted. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a flicker of his long-buried integrity rekindled. He looked at Miller, gave a slow, trembling nod, and stood up. As Miller escorted the doctor through the shadows, Caleb moved toward the town square. He wasn't alone. One by one, then in small groups, the people of Havenwood emerged from their homes. They carried no weapons, only the grim determination of a people who had finally had enough. They were a silent, human barricade, converging on the gallows to bear witness. The judge had wanted to make an example of Ellie Vance. Now, the entire town was preparing to make an example of him. The sun crested the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting a bloody orange light over the town square. Ellie stood on the gallows, her head held high, her gaze fixed not on the noose but on the faces of her neighbors. Judge Blackwood stood beside the hangman, a grim officiant at his own dark ceremony. "Let this be a lesson," he began, his voice booming across the silent crowd. "In the price of defiance. The only defiance here is your own." Her voice, thin but clear, cut through the air. Dr. Aris Thorne stepped through the front line of the crowd, with Deputy Miller at his side. The old doctor's hands still trembled, but his voice was steady, fortified by a lifetime of repressed guilt. "You have defied the laws of God and man, Silas Blackwood. I will not be silent any longer." Before the stunned guards could react, Thorne told the town everything. He spoke of the poison, the forged death certificates, and the massacre of the Cartwright family. He ended by pointing a shaking finger at Ellie. "That woman is not a criminal," he cried, his voice breaking. "She is the last of the bloodline you tried to erase. She is the rightful heir to this valley." A collective roar of outrage rose from the crowd. Blackwood's face contorted in a mask of pure fury. His empire of lies was dissolving before his eyes. In a final, desperate act of tyranny, he drew a pistol from beneath his judicial robes and grabbed Deputy Miller, pulling the young man in front of him as a shield. "Silence!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "This town is mine. I built it. I own it." The crowd fell back, terrified by the sight of the gun. Everyone looked to Caleb, expecting the giant of a man to answer violence with violence. But Caleb didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, pulled a folded, sealed letter from his coat pocket. It was Liam's final letter. "You didn't build anything, Judge," Caleb said, his voice carrying a profound, sorrowful weight that cut through the tension. "You just poisoned the ground that good people tried to build on. My brother knew that, and he left a final testament." He broke the seal and began to read. It wasn't a list of crimes or a call for vengeance. It was a love letter from a husband to his wife. Liam's words filled the morning air, words of his unshakable love for Ellie, his dreams for their son Leo, his hope for a Havenwood where truth could be a foundation, not a threat. He wrote of his faith that even good people make mistakes when they are afraid, and his belief that courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of doing what was right despite it. The simple, honest power of the dead man's words did what no bullet could. They stripped away the judge's power, leaving him exposed not as a tyrant, but as a small, pathetic man whose entire life was a hollow lie. The gun in Blackwood's hand wavered. His face, once a mask of fury, crumpled into a portrait of utter defeat. The pistol slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the wooden platform. It was over. The reign of the Blackwood family had not ended with a bang, but with the whisper of a dead man's hope. For a long moment after Judge Blackwood was led away in disgrace, the town square remained silent, as if the people of Havenwood were collectively waking from a century-long nightmare. The spell of fear was broken. Then Caleb moved. He walked up the steps of the gallows, pulled a knife from his belt, and with a single, swift motion, cut the ropes that bound Ellie's hands. She didn't speak. She simply looked from her freed wrists to the empty noose, then to the face of the man who had walked back into a life he'd abandoned to save hers. A path cleared through the crowd. Martha Thorne walked forward, her face streaked with tears of relief. In her arms, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, was Leo. The moment Ellie saw her son, the iron control she had maintained for days finally shattered. A choked sob escaped her lips as she stumbled down the steps and gathered her child into her arms. She buried her face in the soft folds of his blanket, breathing in the sweet, innocent scent of him, and wept. They were not tears of sorrow, but a torrent of relief, a flood of gratitude so profound it washed away the terror of the preceding days. Caleb stood back, watching the reunion. He felt the heavy knot of guilt he had carried for a decade, the guilt of an older brother who had walked away, finally begin to dissolve. His quest for atonement was over. Ellie looked up, her eyes shining with a gratitude that needed no words. "Thank you, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He simply nodded, a lump forming in his own throat. Then a new sound echoed through the square. The town blacksmith, a man whose hands had been idle with fear for too long, approached the gallows carrying a heavy sledgehammer. He looked at Caleb and held it out. Caleb took it. Together, followed by the other loggers and farmers, they turned to face the grim wooden structure that had symbolized Blackwood's tyranny. The first blow Caleb struck sent a crack splintering through the main support beam. Soon, others joined in, their hammers and axes rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic work of cleansing. They were not just tearing down a gallows, they were dismantling their own prison, splinter by splinter, reclaiming their town with every blow. Ellie held her son close, the warmth of the rising sun on her face, and watched as the symbol of her town's dark past was reduced to nothing more than a pile of broken wood. 1 year later, the autumn sun shone down on a town reborn. The name on the welcome sign no longer read Havenwood. In fresh, bright paint, it now said Liberty Creek. The air itself felt different, lighter, no longer thick with unspoken fear, but crisp with the promise of a hard-won future. On the spot where the gallows had stood, a new schoolhouse was being built, its frame fashioned from the sturdy pines of the valley. The town was healing, rebuilding itself not just with timber and nails, but with courage and honesty. The changes were more than just cosmetic. Ellie Vance, as the last heir of the Cartwrights, now presided over the new town council. She had refused to take the land for herself, instead placing it in a trust for the community, ensuring that no single person could ever hold absolute power again. The town's founding documents were being rewritten, this time telling the true story, honoring the victims rather than the murderers. Justice had rolled down from the state capital. Silas Blackwood would spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary, his name now a whispered cautionary tale rather than a fearsome command. Caleb Vance had stayed. The town had insisted, and for the first time in his solitary life, he felt a sense of belonging he couldn't turn his back on. He now wore the badge of sheriff, his quiet strength a comforting presence rather than an intimidating one. He had found his peace not in the isolation of the mountains, but in the community his brother had died trying to save. That evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the valley, Ellie sat with her son Leo, now a walking, curious toddler. She held a new, leather-bound book in her lap, the first official history of Liberty Creek. She had written it herself. Caleb stood in the doorway of the small cottage, watching them, a gentle smile on his weathered face. Ellie turned a page and pointed to a faded photograph of a smiling, handsome man. "That was your father, Leo," she said softly, her voice clear and steady. "He was a journalist. That means he looked for the truth. He believed that a town, just like a house, has to be built on a strong foundation, not rock or wood." She paused, looking at her son with all the love in her heart. "But on truth, he gave his life to find it, and in doing so, he set us all free." Leo placed his small hand on his father's picture, and in that simple, innocent gesture, an entire legacy was passed on. The story of Havenwood's cruelty was over. The story of Liberty Creek and of Liam Vance's enduring hope was just beginning. The story of Liberty Creek is a powerful reminder that the courage of one can awaken the conscience of many. It shows that no lie, no matter how old, can withstand the simple weight of the truth. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the simplest way possible. Just type the number 1 in the comments below if you believe that justice, in the end, will always prevail. And if you believe that stories like this matter, tales of light pushing back the darkness, and of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell, because the story we have saved for you tomorrow is about a forgotten soldier's letter and a secret that has been waiting over 70 years to be told. You won't want to miss it.